Get in tight.
Get in the hug the machine here. All right, my name is Sean. I'm a tech here at ColDesi with the Avancé Embroidery machine. And today's topic is basically breaking needles. It happens to everybody. I've done it in the past. It's inevitable. You're going to break a needle sooner or later. Majority of the time you break a needle will be on caps. Caps are tricky to sew. Caps actually ride above the needle plate, so it's more of an arc rather than a flat piece of garment, so you get more of a flagging effect when sewing on a cap, and that is normally when you get your thread breaks, is right on the seam of the cap, which is right here in the middle. That's normally when you get a lot of your thread breaks. Another object to look at is when you're hooping a hat and you've got your design on the hat. I know you want to try to stretch it to the limit, but the closer you get up here to the band, the more the hat sits here and starts to rise up, so it's no longer flat like the rest of the hat, so your needle actually goes in at an angle, hits the cap at an angle, and then deflects, most likely hitting your needle plate. You might get a lot of scratches on your needle plate. That'll cause a lot of thread breaks. So the first key to making sure that your machine and you don't get thread breaks is, first thing I would want to look at would be the actual cap driver. Cap driver, when it sits on your machine, should ride across this arm nice and smooth, which you can see down in here. Thank you, Mark. This black part of the cap driver, let me turn off the light here. Yeah. This black part of the cap driver, you want to be just above the arm that runs from the front to the back of the machine. So by moving it left or forward and backward, looking below, you want to make sure it runs as close as possible to this part, but not actually hit. To do that, there are below down here inside, there are 4 Allen screws that you will loosen, and that will allow you to take the cap driver and raise it up, down, left, and right.
Let me see if I can get a light there that we can use, and I'll bring the camera down so people can see.
Okay.
Okay, there's a light. And since I'm here, I may as well be useful.
All right, so down in here, these 4 Allen screws, which are sitting right here, 2 on each side, you want to just loosen up. Then you can take this cap driver and move it up and down, left and right. So if you feel that your cap driver sitting up in here along the arm, right here, isn't riding smooth, or you think it's too high up, too much of a gap, what you want to do is loosen those 4 Allen screws, push this down, and then tighten the 4 Allen screws back up. When you do tighten it and you push it down, what I usually tell customers to do is to move your frame left and right to rotate your cap driver to make sure the screw sitting in the back on either side underneath does not hit the rail. If you feel that you're turning left and right and you're hearing a clicking sound, which this one we're not, so we're a good distance, but if you're hearing a clicking sound, loosen the 4 screws, lift it back up a hair, tighten them, and retest. Because if it hits while it's sewing, that's going to cause it to jump. So your outline, your registration will all be off.
Oh yeah, and we get that on the CAS group. That's a common thing about the stitches jumping from one place to another.
Yep.
So registration is off.
So you want to make sure that that doesn't rub, excuse me, hit in the back. Also, when you do loosen those 4 screws and you're pulling this up and down, make sure that when you move it, you don't move it left and right, because you can shift this off.
Okay.
You want to make sure these rails are pretty much the same on both sides of your needle plate once you tighten it back up.
Right. Okay.
That would be the first thing I would look at. Once you've got that done down pat, the next big thing is the hooping of the cap.
Let me ask something while I've got the camera pointed over here. Is we hear a lot of talk about using the correct needle plate for caps. Is that still the case on the latest Avancés?
No, the latest Avancés come with a universal needle plate. Now, as you can see, the universal, you've got a little raised lip around the hole on the needle plate.
Okay.
Older styles, you would have to swap out the flat plate for the needle plate.
And how would they
swap it out?
No, if they wanted a universal plate, what would they have to do?
Well, these will not fit the old styles.
Ah, okay. So they're going to have to go back and forth.
Right.
Gotcha.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, you'll have to go back and forth because the old style, the needle plate didn't have this cover, and it actually folded down.
Okay, I get it.
So this one's a lot shorter, and it's got a cover covering the picker and the bobbin. So unfortunately, you'll have to swap back and forth. That's another big thing. If you're sewing on caps with the older Avancés, make sure you've got the cap needle plate on. And you can distinguish that because it has a raised hole compared to the flat needle plate, and it's maybe a 1/4 inch smaller.
Okay. I'm going to put the camera back on the stand here because I know Sean is going to talk about caps and hooping and everything. And I'll let him do that.
All right.
Sorry if you get nauseous.
So once we've worked on the cap driver, we got the right needle plate on, we're good to go there. The next one you want to do is look at hooping your hat. If your hat's not hooped properly, that's also going to cause issues. If it's loose, if it's buckled, you have ripples up here, that's going to cause a lot of issues. So when hooping, you do want to make sure this band, the silver band, runs along the seam between the bill and the cap so that it actually grips and holds it in place. If you find that it's here, it's on good on one side, but then as it goes the other side, it kind of goes off. Your hat's, one, is hooped crooked. Two, it's not holding the hat as tight as it should, which could cause you issues down the road. The other thing you want to make sure you use is backing, which I have here. I have one piece of tearaway backing. That is also important when sewing on caps. Now I know there are some really stiff caps out there, like flex fit caps and even Richardson caps, which are a little bit stiffer than the flex fits. I've had customers do several things to it. I've taken where they had a hat in hand and they just roll the front of it here to loosen up the stiffness of the cap. If you have smart sizer, you can spray it in the back along the buckram. And then I've also had one customer actually iron the front of the cap. Time consuming, I know, but it seemed to work really well for them. The one thing that I would do is just before you hoop the cap, just take in your hand and just roll it, like you're just rolling a piece of paper. Just smooth this out and make it as soft as possible. And then once you do that, make sure it's hooped nice and snug, nice and tight. If you're not really sewing on the sides, you still want to try to get your seam along both sides to be underneath the metal bands here. You don't want it to start here and all of a sudden pop up and have all this, your sweatband sitting all the way up here. Because what happens is now it's not tight, this is really loose up here, that's going to cause issues when it's sewing. The needle will hit it, it'll move, deflect, hit the needle plate and break. So you want to make sure you have your hat hooped nice and snug all the way from ear to ear. You want to make sure that band is right against the seam. And then a couple of things I've suggested to customers, especially on flex fits. The back of the cap, you know, this is an auto cap, works really great. It's nice. We got a lot of styles. Is your paper clips. Flex fit caps, if you're not sewing on the side, one thing you can do is just take the back of the caps and just tuck them on the inside of the two bars. And then clip them down here. Because if you have them on the outside, what you're doing is you're putting a lot of strain, a lot of stress on the front, and you're pulling it back this way, clipping them down so it's nice and snug. Putting it on the inside gives it a little more movability and doesn't strain or stress out the cap, causing issues while you're sewing. So that would be the two big things with the cap driver. The cap driver and then making sure your hat is hooped nice and tight. The other thing that you want to look at is you want to look at your needles. The needles that come on the embroidery machine are 7511 sharp needles. You definitely do not want to use ballpoints on caps because ballpoints will hit the fabric and deflect. You want a sharp needle to actually penetrate the fabric of the hat, go to the bobbin, hook it up, and come back out. For your flex fits or your Richardson caps, I would suggest doing a 7511 sharp titanium needle, which is the same strength as an 80/12 needle. Coleman & Company sell the 7511 titanium needles, and it's a smaller hole, but it's just as strong as using an 80/12, which I do have some customers using an 80/12 titanium needle, which is a really strong needle. The other thing you want to do is slow the sewing field of the machine down to 600 to 700. That'll help out with the moving of the cap with the needle as it goes in and out of the cap driver, because when you have the cap on the machine, you notice the crown of the cap is round. So you'll actually get a little bit of flagging as you're sewing. By lowering your cap driver, you're going to reduce that flagging. You'll still get some, but you're going to reduce it, causing less issues while sewing. The other thing that we try to look at now is the needle depth. Needle depth is not really tricky. It does take some work to do. What you want to do for your needle depth is is there is a needle depth gauge that you can purchase, and it's a lot easier using the needle depth gauge. What you want to do is take your bobbin out of the case. You'll put your needle gauge in. You will slide the front panel off your machine, and you're going to lower your machine down, your needle down, to 172 degrees. And then what you're doing is with that needle gauge in there and you're turning the needle gauge, you should have that needle barely rubbing against the needle gauge tool, indicating it's got the proper depth. If you're rotating it and that needle's not touching it at all, your needle is too high and you will need to lower it. To lower it, it's by loosening the bottom of the two screws here, which let me zoom in so I can show you. You've got two screws here. You've got the top one and you got the bottom one. You want to loosen the bottom one and then just gradually just push down until that needle hits the top of that needle gauge. Turn it, and you want to make sure the needle barely rubs against it, so it's barely scratching. If you're turning the gauge and that needle is almost flexing as it's rotating the needle gauge, your needle depth is too low. Same thing, loosen that screw, pull it up a little bit, rotate it, lower it, rotate it until it barely, it will move as it goes, but you got a slight movement, but you'll barely hear a scrape mark as you rotate that needle gauge. So once you do that, you tighten that back up. If you did happen to lower this needle gauge, you want to look at your upper dead stop. So as much as you lower the needle down, you want to loosen the top one and raise it up just that much. So if I've loosened this up and I drop it down 2 millimeters, I want to roughly loosen the top one and move it up 2 millimeters, because what you're doing is that's helping the reciprocator engage the needle. You take this and you drop the bottom one down so that you got the right needle depth, but you didn't touch the top one. When it goes to pick up the needle, you'll see it pick it up and then quickly drop it. That means it's too low for it to actually grab. So you want to come to the top one and raise it up. And we do have documents on how to do the needle depth. But that would be another thing I would want to look at, to where if it is not the right depth, oh, I got it upside down. If it's not the right depth, that'll also cause issues when sewing on caps. So you want to make sure you've got all those bases covered when sewing, and you will find a big difference when sewing on caps. We do that here, and we go through and we check all of the needle depths, make sure we got that correct, and then we'll come through and we'll check the actual presser foot depth. The presser foot, you want to make sure the presser foot is low enough so that when it does sew and comes down, it's pushing the cap down as far as possible before actually the needle goes through and penetrates it. To check this, what you want to do is take the black dial on the right side of your machine, push it in, rotate it several times around until you get your needle to go through the needle plate, and you want it to be at the lowest point as possible. So on screen, you're going to have it at 172 degrees, and at that 172 degrees, there is a presser foot gauge that you'll be able to slip underneath here, or it's roughly the size of a dime to a nickel, and that's as low as you want that presser foot to be sitting. When you've got that depth, you're good to go. If you need to adjust this, I will show you right here. It is simply loosening this Phillips screw right here, which is on the top of the presser foot. Loosen it, push it down, pull it up, tighten it back up, and now you've adjusted your presser foot. We've got documentation on this as well. Those two you might not have to do, you might never need to do, but it's something that if you're seeing a lot of needle breaks and you've adjusted everything else and you got everything the way it's supposed to be, that would be an indication you might want to look at your needle depth. We don't sell currently the needle depth gauge. We are looking into that, but I think so many parts might sell one that you'll be able to look at, and that will definitely help out. If you don't have one, what you can do is you can take a 6 millimeter Allen wrench and set it on top of the inside the rotary hook, but on top of the center post, so that sits on the top part. When you lower it down to 172 and then check that, you can turn it and you can feel if it hits it. If it hits it, you're good. Take it out, go to the next needle, and check all the needles that way. Those would be the major big things to help out while sewing on caps, and if you're breaking needles on caps. Caps are the worst when breaking needles. It's very rare I talk to anybody that's broken a needle on flat mode, unless you're sewing in, say, a Carhartt jacket or a thick material, canvas material. But normally it is on caps that we talk to people about breaking needles. So if you look at your cab driver, you adjust that. You look at how you hoop the hat, make sure it's nice and hoop tight, make sure it's snug. Do the necessities to the cap to make sure it's nice and smooth, soft for the sewing field. Make sure that your needle depth is the correct depth, the needle height, the pressure foot, slowing the machine down. You should have no more needle breaks. But like I said in the beginning, once in a great while you're going to get that needle break. I mean, everybody does, but you should not be breaking them constantly, and you should not be breaking them at least one a hat or one every run. I mean, I'm talking, you might have a needle break every couple of weeks or a couple of months or longer. But those would definitely be the big ones that I would want to look at, would be those parts right there in fixing all of your needle breaks. Do you have any questions so far on this? All right, yeah. There are some customers, that's a good question. I use one piece of backing. We do have some customers that double up. They might use two pieces of backing. They could use a heavy cutaway and one piece of tearaway. I've had customers slow the machine down to 500 to 550 stitches a minute. Make sure you oil your machine. Make sure it's well oiled. That's another big thing. But yeah, that's a good question. I use one piece of backing. We use one here when we sew our designs before we send them out. But you can double up if you need to double up on backing. I would use two pieces of cutaway. If you're sewing 14 inches or ear to ear, make sure your backing covers all the sewing fields. If you're sewing just on the hat, that's going to cause issues because there's nothing for that hat to grab onto like the backing, which will help stabilize it, and that'll cause you issues as well if you don't have the proper backing all the way around. I wouldn't go just on using the buckram that's in most of the hats in the back, that white mesh. Still definitely use a tearaway, if not two pieces of tearaway. That'll definitely give your hat some more stability. Are there any other questions? All right, let's see. Is it really necessary to change out the needle plate on the older machines? I've just been leaning the hat plate in and have not had any problems. That's a good question. It is recommended you swap it out, but little tricks, you talk to different techs, you don't have to switch the needle plates out. We recommend doing it. That's what the manufacturer recommends. But when we get demos here or sometimes, or we, during trainings, we don't swap out the plates and you won't have any issues. You might have someone that has every kind of issue. So if that happens, it could be because of the needle depth or the pressure foot height. But if you're not having any issues with the sewing on the flat needle plate, by all means keep sewing. You don't have to swap it out. All you're doing is you're just raising it up just a little bit to stop a lot of the flagging. But if your cap driver is lowered enough and your needle depths are good and your pressure foot and you're sewing and not doing any and not having any issues, by all means leave the flat needle plate on there. You don't have to swap it out. We as techs just recommend it because that's what the manufacturer recommends. But we have field techs that go to customers' locations and on multi-heads, and they leave the flat needle plate on the multi-heads, and they have no issues. So it's a personal preference, but you're not going to hurt the machine by leaving the flat needle plate on the machine. That's a good question. Any other questions? Oh, you're leaving the taller one on. The cap, yeah, I mean, the cap needle plate for flat mode, you're not going to hurt a thing. You can definitely leave the cap needle plate on for both flat and caps. Even in our showroom, You know, when we had an older machine up there, I never switched out the cat needle plate. I left it on because you're sewing on flat mode, so you're not going to hurt anything by leaving the cat needle plate on. So yeah, no worries there. Just go ahead and leave the cat needle plate on, and you'll be fine as well, because when sewing on flat, it's rubbing right across the base of the needle plate, so it's not going to cause any issues. So yeah, you're good. Are there any other questions? I do hope everybody has got some kind of information and learned a little bit today. We tried finding a topic that will, you know, we go through our tickets and you know, talk to people and on our CS Facebook website, and just find out what you know, what people are having issues with, and you know, we look to doing tech talks like that. So I hope everybody learned something today. I do appreciate you coming out and you know, going through this with me today. If there's no other questions, I hope everybody has a great rest of your week, and we'll see you on the next Talk Talk.